For the medieval apple pie, I started off with 4 pounds of apples. I did a mix of Granny Smith and Honey Crisp, which I chopped up and placed into a processor until it formed kind of like a mush. And then I placed that into a bowl to which I added half a cup of raisins, half a cup of chopped figs, and 2 tablespoons of sugar, 1 tablespoon of pumpkin spice instead of a spice mixture that was usually used, and a bit of turmeric instead of saffron, which the recipe originally called for. And then I mixed this until it was all integrated, and I kind of just set this aside and started on the dough. For the dough, I started off by boiling a cup of water, to which I added a cup of vegetable shortening until it started simmering, and then I just set that aside. In a bowl, I placed 4 cups of all-purpose flour and a pinch of salt. I then added the vegetable shortening mixture and I mixed it until it was cool enough for me to knead. And then I kind of just made sure it didn't get too cool, because then once it gets too cool, it's kind of harder to work with. I then assembled the pie crust, or the coffin, which is what it was commonly called back then. And then I just assembled it, made sure there were no holes or cracks in it, and then I just building the walls to make sure it was sturdy and none of the filling would come out. And then I started filling the coffin with my apple mixture of dried figs and raisins and all the spices that I used. And then I just filled it until it was filled to the very top, and I kept filling. Yeah, just a lot of filling. And then once I was done filling my coffin, I added the top crust, which I had previously rolled out, and I just closed up any of the holes that were there, and then just sealed it at the sides, made sure there were no holes so that none of the juices would come out. And then I added some vent holes so that the pressure would come out and wouldn't explode in the oven or something like that. I just did a little hole in the center, and then I added a few slits on the sides around it. And pretty much, yeah, that's what I did for vent holes. And then after that, I put it in the oven at 375 for 45 minutes. And then I just waited till it was golden on the outside. This pie wasn't really that good. And yeah, the filling was weird. And then that's what it was supposed to look like. It didn't really look like that, but yeah, pretty much that's it. For the modern apple pie recipe, I started off with 1 1/3 cup of all-purpose flour and 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. I pulsed that together in the processor until it was all mixed together. I then did 20 tablespoons of butter chopped into smaller pieces. I pulsed that together until it was crumbly, except I did it for a little too long and it was kind of just starting to mix together. After that, I took it out and then put it into a bowl, to which I added 6 tablespoons of cold water and 1 tablespoon of cold apple cider vinegar. I had to add more flour because mine was getting too sticky. I just kneaded this, wrapped it, and chilled it. And then I started with 4 pounds of Granny Smith apples, which I peeled. I cored them, I sliced them into pretty small slices, thin slices, for the filling. Yeah, the filling was pretty simple to make. It was really good, and yeah. Here I'm just slicing them. My hand's covering most of the apple, so you can't really see what I'm doing, but yeah. I just did this. It took a while to do all this, but yeah. And then after that, I did 1/3 of a cup of cane sugar, 1/3 of a cup of packed brown sugar, 1 tablespoon of pumpkin spice, and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And then I kind of just mixed that together until it was all integrated. Kind of had to break down that brown sugar. And then I just kept mixing this, mix. Just took a bit. And then After this, I grabbed my apples, which I had set aside, and then I added my apples and mixed this, and then I set this mixture aside for 30 minutes to let the kind of like the juices come out of it, and then for 30 minutes, and then I placed my apples into a pot that I had already heated up. I added 1 tablespoon of lemon juice, 3 tablespoons of cold water with cornstarch to make like a slurry. I also added lemon zest and vanilla, which I forgot to put in there. Got a clip of it, and then I just mixed this together until it was all warm. And then I grabbed my dough, which I had made previously 2 days before. I rolled it out, and then kind of just until it was like flat enough. And then I put it onto my pie plate, which was a 9.5-inch pie plate. And then I just made sure it was well in there, and I tried to fix any of those cracks. This was my first time making pie, so I didn't really know what I was doing. I then placed plastic wrap over it, and then I chilled it in the fridge for about 30 minutes. I repeated the same process with the top crust. I rolled it out, and then I just placed it over the plate, and then chilled it again. Placed the plastic wrap, chilled it for 30 minutes, and then I got to the fun part, which was assembling it. I just took my pie crust out of the fridge. I assembled it, put the filling in there, made sure it was all in there. I got the juices and everything. And then I rolled out my top crust over the filling, and then I just started kind of like sealing it together, and then I crimped it. I just did whatever method this is called. I just did this one. Yeah, ignore my fingers, they look a little weird in this clip. And then I made vent holes. I just did these like 4 little lines. And the vent holes are pretty much just so that the air comes out of it, and the pressure that builds up inside just doesn't like make the pie explode. I just did like these little lines to make it like look cool and pretty. And then I got an egg, and then I beat that egg up, and then just I did an egg wash with it, and then I put coarse sugar over it, which kind of like caramelized over it and kind of burnt in the end, but that's okay. And then basically after this, I just put all the coarse sugar, and then I baked it in the oven for a bit. Now onto the history of apple pie, which is actually really interesting. Basically the first apple pie, which was the first recipe that I made, comes from the cookbook called The Form of Curry by Samuel Pegg. It was made by the cooks of King Richard in 1390. This was a royal cookbook, and most royal cookbooks were very vague, since the chief master chefs told those who were cooking what to do. And then basically there would just be a scribe in the background writing kind of like a vague idea of what was said. And then raisins and figs, which were part of the recipe, were very imported from the Mediterranean or France sometimes. Saffron was actually one of the only spices that was grown in England at the time. And spices would have made this dish expensive, which was why it was made in a royal kitchen for the kings. And spices were most likely a mixture known as poudre douce, which I'm guessing is French, and known as sweet powders, which was a mixture of different spices, and basically just differed based on the chef and who was making it and stuff. And then sugar was also considered a spice back then. And then the crusts were made to be containers for the food, basically, and not all were eaten. And the crusts were usually called coffins, which is really interesting. And then the King Charlemagne was the one who named various apple varieties around the year 800. Many are either extinct or changed, so it's practically impossible to exactly replicate the pie, just as it was back then. And then a lot of times apples were grown in monasteries by monks, but Charlemagne wanted food to be grown all throughout the kingdom, not just like wheat and grain, so he wanted different foods. And then some recipes, there are some recipes that are Dutch, that are found from around 1514. And then the first American apple pie recipe was recorded in 1796. So apple pie isn't American, which is kind of sad. It was recorded in 1796 by Amelia Simmons in her cookbook American Cookery. And there were actually 2 recipes. One was a regular and one was like a buttery apple pie recipe. And then John T. Edge wrote a book called Apple Pie, An American Story, which stated that during wartime, soldiers looked forward to having apple pie. And then, like many said, that they would look forward to having apple pie and seeing their mothers. And then the phrase "as American apple pie" isn't really like known where it came from, but one of the first recorded times where it was recorded was in the Gettysburg Times in 1924, which said, "Newslet suits are as American as apple pie." And then during World War II, many soldiers said that they fought for their mothers and apple pie. And this also just popularized the phrase "as American as apple pie." And then over time, apple pie just evolved into what we know it as today. And it's eaten at Thanksgiving or just many times throughout the year. And yeah, it's really good.